Hi, I'm Christian Chiller, back with another interview and demo from a tech startup I have encountered on my travels. This time it is the turn of Cerbos. They have an open source tool and then a commercial product on top that helps developers implement permissions and roles within minutes. Let's take a look. I'm joined by Emra and Alex from Cerbos. Now, again, I feel like I've been saying this a lot this week. We met at Web Summit, and you had a really cool demo that I didn't really manage to capture properly, so I thought we would do it again. And that's what we are here to do. But maybe let's start with a little bit of an introduction to what is Cerbos before we get to that.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having us here. So Cerbos empowers developers to implement, manage, and delegate fine-grained access control in software applications in a fraction of time that it would actually take them. It would take them to build and maintain it in-house. We provide an authorization layer for applications where developers can ultimately map actions to roles and be able to easily manage that. I'll tell you what Cerbos isn't as well, so that actually clearly distinguishes in developers' mind. Cerbos doesn't do your authentication. Cerbos doesn't do the directory. All of those things happen upstream by another system, like well-known ones are, Azure Active Directory, Cognito, Okta, Auth0. Cerbos is the fact where once you know who the user is and what role they have, for developers to be able to manage what are the portions, what are the resources that they can actually access, and what are the portions they can't. So Cerbos helps with the implementation and enforcement of access control and authorization layer.
Okay. Just one thing I wanted to check. You have a slight differentiation between open source Cerbos and non-open source. So maybe let's quickly clarify the differences between those two as well.
So the difference, that I wouldn't say difference, it's that one is built on top of another. So Cerbos is an open core, open source product. So if you're a developer willing to take the core and implement it yourself and run it yourself and establish all of the pipelines, etc., it's free and available under Apache 2 license. And Cerbos Hub is ultimately a management layer, management interface control plane that sits on top of Cerbos open source and open core. So as a developer, if you like to actually implement Cerbos, it runs in your own environment and it's available in under Apache 2. You just download a manifest or download our binary and run it. And if you'd like to actually take advantage of Cerbos Hub, which is the management layer, all you really do is like two lines of configuration change to point your open source instances to the hub. And Hub is what we're going to demo today to you because that's what we recently released. And Hub is the management layer that allows you to collaboratively build and test policies. And then it runs the CI/CD for those policies to help you make deployment very easily, as well as building a WebAssembly bundle. So the same policies can very easily be embedded at the edge.
Okay. And if I don't use Hub, where am I running Cerbos typically? In like a cluster or a container or something else?
Absolutely. So Cerbos runs in your own environment, wherever you like to, wherever your environment is. If you're running it in a cloud, it runs in your environment in the cloud. If you're running it on-prem, it runs on-prem. We have customers running it on physical ATM machines, but Cerbos is distributed as a binary. And wherever you like to run that binary, we provide a bunch of different ways of deploying it. Typical runtimes include running it in a Kubernetes service, Kubernetes sidecar. We have customers running it in AWS Lambda or just bare metal.
Okay. And just to kind of piece together that final picture of how things connect up. So I have application and infrastructure. I have an authentication service, and then I use Cerbos in the middle of those to say these users who authenticate with this service can access these resources. Is that
so?
basically?
If I can share a diagram from our website, I can very easily take you through that as a high-level architecture.
Okay.
This is Cerbos as an open source. This is straight out of our website under How It Works section. So Cerbos runs in your environment. So this is a typical architecture that you would see of an application, right? There's a browser, requests and responses go up to your API. And after your API, once you figure out who the user is and what they're trying to do, your application usually has all of that context. At that point, whenever an action needs to be checked, whether that user is allowed to do that, your application using our SDKs and API would communicate with Cerbos, asking the question, can this principal do this action on this resource? And Cerbos is a binary, as I mentioned, is running in your own environment right next to your application, because we want to make sure the latency is as minimal as possible, because this is an authorization check that will be happening on every single API interaction with your application. Cerbos looks at it as policies, looks at all of that authorization logic that you've actually extracted out of your code and put it in policy form, evaluates that request and tells you allow or deny. And then your application implements that very simple API.
Okay. The policy you say you define in the application or elsewhere?
Yes. So the policy, where policy comes from is normally, traditionally, you would have an if-then-else block on your application. So I'll give you again a great example from our website. Normally in an application, you would have a logic like this, saying that if the user's email address belongs to my company and they are in a specific region, allow certain things. These if-then-else statements, everything starts as a very simple if-then-else statement in applications. And they start getting more and more complex as you add more departments and more requirements and anything else. And this is, if you have a monolithic application, it's best managed in a library, and then you can put all of your logic there and you're done. But as your application grows and suddenly one monolith starts turning into, I heard this term, I forgot the term, but basically a monolith with a bunch of arms. I've been talking about it like when you actually start adding
monolithic octopus?
Something like that.
A monopus. I don't know.
Monopus. So it's like, the very first transition is you still have your monolith, but you also start having a couple of microservices around it until you go into pure microservice architecture. This logic now starts getting replicated more and more. And two main problems with this logic, when that monolith with the octopus arms, every time you make a change to that policy, now you have to change this policy in multiple places. So suddenly, that turns into a deployment problem. How do you deploy that all at the same time? And second is, when you have multiple microservices or multiple services, suddenly what happens is you now need to take this logic or whatever changes you have to this logic. You need to actually translate them into multiple languages and make sure nothing gets lost in translation. So the API that Cerbos is actually allowing you to do is taking this logic and putting it in policies, which I'll show you in a second, in very simple YAML policies and what they look like. But in return, now you have a very simple API call, because now all of that logic check is being done centrally at Cerbos. Right? So what's turning into is this logic, as we were looking at the how it works diagram, is now, let me open the open source version first, turning into this policy. So all of that logic is now encoded into a policy, and that policy can be stored anywhere you like. And that policy is still owned and hosted by you. Right?
Okay. And I think you were, maybe it was just below the fold on the last page you had, but how do you define that policy in open source and Hub?
In both open source and Hub, that policy is I'll take you to here, to our playground.
Now I remember you showing me this at
Yes.
Web Summit. This was actually pretty cool, yeah.
Exactly. So you are defining that policy in YAML, and we have a very simple policy DSL here, where it's very similar in essence, very similar to it's somewhere between a Kubernetes manifest and an AWS IAM roles and permissions, but it's a very simple YAML that's human reusable that has been enhanced with Google's common expression language to be able to express any condition. So we've actually used Google's common expression language. I'll give you a couple of examples from here. Very simple one. This is a policy. If you can see, I'll make it slightly larger. So this is a policy from a finance application from an expense report, right? This policy says an admin can do all of the actions. An owner, somebody in a finance team or region manager can view it. The approver field can be viewed by finance and finance manager. But now, so we can actually go into a little bit of a detail, like an owner of an expense can only update it if the status is open. Once it's been submitted, you don't want them to update something. Or we can do things like a finance manager can approve an expense if they are not the owner of it and the status is open, because you don't want people to approve their own. Or you can actually talk about different limits, amounts that you can actually limit. These are all the different things. But so within Cerbos Hub, we have this collaborative playground where you can actually make changes to each one of these policies and in real time observe what would happen to a permission. So let's just say, deny to this, and let's just pick a user that's in the finance team, right? So suddenly the various different approve action as actually changes permissions. So what we have is ability to be able to define each one of these different users, you simulate a bunch of different users in different roles, with as well as different types of resources you can actually simulate depending on what the different types of resources, and ultimately have a playground that's collaborative. Multiple people log in as Google Doc style. You can actually edit these policies. The point is, we actually are composing a policy that will encapsulate all of our business requirements in a very safe environment, where we can also write tests against this. We can actually say, oh, so hold on a second, some permission has changed, so this test is failing. So this is where the collaboration between a developer and somebody who's only updating the policies comes into place, because as a developer of the system, you can actually set all these boundaries with unit tests and make sure that any policy change is not going to actually break an existing rule. But it gives a very safe and guardrailed development environment for all of these policies.
Yeah. And just out of interest, this test side,
this is all part of Cerbos Hub. So within Cerbos and Cerbos Hub, we provide this platform where you can actually start writing your tests and everything else. And Cerbos Hub is in the background running all these tests all the time. So again, it's a collaborative.
And the tests are also YAML files.
Exactly. Tests are, so basically in the test, you define your principles, how many different users you're going to have, what role they're going to be. How many different resources you want to actually have. These are your sample resources. And then at that point, you also build your matrix here, right? You have your fixture of, if Sally for expense, what are the actions, what are the expected results for a given, user and resource combination. So every time that policy is updated, all of these tests are running in the background. So if I'm going to change a test, which is not that kosher, but suddenly you'll see it failing because the policy isn't actually complying with it. Usually, the flow of this would be, your fixtures, your tests. Sorry, what did I view? allow.
You did this on purpose, yeah? Live debugging.
Exactly. Expected deny, but actual is allow. Which one is this? Sally expense 3, which action delete. There we go. Allow. So all the tests are now passing. So normally you would actually be playing with policies, and every time you make a policy change, you want to make sure that everything is correct. But hold on a second. If we ever change this policy limit to be at 30,000, suddenly one of the rules are actually failing because somebody in the finance team shouldn't be able to do anything above 10,000.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So this is part one.
Right. Oh, okay, cool. Just very, very quickly though, if you are not using Hub, then basically everything is just the YAML files.
Whether you're using Hub or not, it's always a YAML file. All the policies are YAML files. Yeah. You can still use the playground that's in the Hub and build your policies and actually export them if you want to use them with your but now and regardless whether you're using Cerbos Hub or sorry, I'm just gonna switch to this how it works diagram because you're gonna get a better understands it. Whether you're using Cerbos Hub or Cerbos open source, somehow you need to feed these policies into your Cerbos instance. In the open source version, you configure each one of these instances to tell them where the policies are stored. That's those different storage mechanisms can be a database, your Git repo, a disk, S3, or GCS storage. So each one of these instances themselves, if you have multiple instances connected, they themselves connect to that source, and you also specify a timeout, a frequency to check for any updates. So let's say every minute check if there's an update to a policy. Within the open source environment, we give you a test framework that you can actually use. We give you GitHub Actions, we give you that playground. But ultimately, as a developer, you're in charge of building that CI/CD pipeline. Every time there's a change, running those tests and deploying it to your favorite storage mechanism. And at that point, Cerbos instances themselves check that source. And if they ever detect an update, they download it, they compile it, and they hot update themselves. So from that moment on, they go with the new instance.
Cool.
However, in bigger deployments where you have more than one instance, suddenly for that 1 minute of frequency or whatever the frequency is, your multiple instances might be actually out of sync because depending on when they have been started, etc. So there comes the deployment challenge for a bigger system. And this is exactly where Cerbos Hub comes into play, where rather than individual instances connecting to their policies, Cerbos Hub runs the CI/CD pipeline. Every time there's a change detected in the policy, Cerbos Hub now automatically compiles that and runs all the tests. And once everything is fine, Cerbos Hub and now in real time distributes that update to all of your instances at the same time. And Cerbos Hub is also capable of, you can tag different types of instances with different environments. So you can actually control which environments get the update, which environments not. So I'll show you that within Cerbos Hub very quickly. So we have this Cerb Finance application. So number one, what we see is number of builds, right? So these are the builds. Every time there's been an update, Cerbos Hub automatically detected that a change and generated a new bundle, a new build. So these builds are also, you can actually say, you can have different tags for each one of your builds so that you can control which build is rolled out to which environment. More importantly, every time one of those instances launch, they actually register themselves with Cerbos Hub, right? So now you are in control of how many instances are running, what label they have been labeled with, and which bundle they're running, and what version they're in. So each one of those little Cerbos instances that we were seeing earlier are all registered with Cerbos Hub.
Okay.
Make sense?
Is this the version of the policy or the version
These are the commits. So ultimately, we have all of those policies in GitHub. So you can actually see which bundle, what version of the bundle they have. Each one of them are running.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So going back to this, how Cerbos works, one other thing I'd like to show is so that, what you've seen with Cerbos Hub is that all those deployments, you can have different versions running. But one other side artifact of Cerbos Hub is this WebAssembly bundle. So just like this binary, we also generate a WebAssembly version of that. Just by the Cerbos binary, we have a WebAssembly bundle of that binary. And this is especially handy for environments where A, you cannot run a binary, and B, you would like to actually embed it as a library rather than anything else. So what we see is if you're running an environment, your software in Netlify, Vercel, etc., it's very easy to actually embed this. But a very similar situation is, let's say you're running a React front end and a backend API. And in the React front end, you want to actually make a bunch of permission checks to actually decide whether to render a button or render a section or render a different tab. And one thing you can do, you can of course make a full request to the backend, figure out the permissions and deliver it back. But another easier and faster way of doing that is with the WebAssembly bundle actually running in your front end. You can make all those checks very quickly, render your UI, fully knowing that if anything ever goes wrong or somebody gets in the middle, you always have the backend also secured by Cerbos API, and Cerbos service and the bundle are always in sync.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. All right. Is there anything else you want to show, or can I ask some more questions?
Please ask away.
Okay, so let's begin first with you have a fair few moving parts here. When did you start on this journey?
So we started on Cerbos' journey back in March 2021. Back in 2020. Okay. So let me correct that. The Cerbos as an idea was started back in 2016 when we were working in our previous company and when we were rewriting our entire authorization layer for the third time, asking ourselves, A, why are we rewriting this again? B, isn't there something we can actually embed? And the answer was, nothing out there really works for our microservices deployment and everything else. And we're better off just writing it ourselves, which took a team of 4 senior engineers about 3 months to build an extensible and scalable system. And that was the last time we did that. So during that, we even built a prototype of what Cerbos is today, and never implemented it because we were like, oh, this is going to take, who's going to manage this? Who's going to actually improve this, etc. So it was baked into our product. And back in January 21, we revived this idea. We got great feedback from various different companies that we were design partnering with. And March 21, we started as a company. And the first open source of Cerbos was rolled out, was released in August 21. And then Cerbos and about 31 versions of Cerbos later, we rolled out Cerbos Hub back in November.
Okay. Is it just the two of you, or is there more?
No, absolutely not. In the founding team, it's 3 of us who lived through this, but today we are 15. We are fully remote from New Zealand to west coast of US and a long way around the world.
Okay. And what happened in 2021 that made you want to finally do this in the intervening years?
I was looking into, what the next venture to start, and I was looking into, what are the different opportunities, and one of my mentors said, focus on things focus on the domains rather than just chase money, chase financial opportunity. And then when I was ruminating through all of the previous pains as a CTO and as a development team we had to go through, this one just stuck out. And it stuck out as an unaddressed problem, right? So when you look in authorization, or when you look into a security layer of software, what you see is authentication, authorization, directory, and logs. Authentication has been addressed by Okta, Auth0, and similar companies. Directory has been addressed since the 1980s or so, starting with LDAP and various other reincarnations of that. Logs have been addressed for a while ago, but authorization never been addressed because authorization among them is the hardest one to decouple. Right? Authorization logic is very close to business logic, and it's not very easy and clear how to really separate that. And our very first months, we were very much so focusing on what's going to be our very clear API. Like, what's the API to authorization where, business logic ends and authorization logic begins. And that's exactly the API the very first API we implemented, which is, can this principal do this action to this resource? And then the answer is allow or deny. And then everything started with that, and then we built around it.
Yeah. And I mean, you've gone really, in the relatively short space of time, you've gone really heavy on the integrations as well. I guess you kind of have to in this space. A lot of language support. Obviously, a lot of the identities as well.
Absolutely.
Most of the major ones I think people would think about.
Yep.
And the deployment models as well. Yeah. I mean, how... I mean, even 15 people is not a massive amount, although you could argue it's possibly a good amount. How did you decide which of these things to implement? Was it just like, these are the big players, or was it based on what people asked for?
So we start with, what's needed in this ecosystem for this to be successful. Number one, as we integrate with applications, number one was SDK support, because we want to make sure that although we are decoupling authorization from your main code, we want to make sure that it is as native, as natural as possible to the developer who's making that call. So that's where we actually started building our SDKs. And building SDKs were both easy and hard, but relatively easy because of a couple of design decisions we've done. We heavily use protobuf and protobuf as our definition, so everything is typed, etc. So a generation of SDKs were okay, and we very much so focus on, again, SDK's efficiency by using gRPC and various other things. So there's a commonality across all of these SDKs, but we wanted to make sure that all of these SDKs were available, so to the developer, it's natural. Then when it comes to looking at integrations with different frameworks or identity providers, at the end of the day, our API is still the same API. So these are all examples of how to integrate with different frameworks. So they're not necessarily out of the box integration. So if we discount the first three, which I'm going to go into in a second, but with all the other major frameworks, it's a very much so examples of, where to best intercept that call, where to best make that authorization decision call, and how to handle it. The first three are actually implementations of our API for different ORMs. Okay. What the examples we have there is, because authorization is not necessarily only at the API request time, checking if somebody can do something or not, but sometimes you have billion records in your database, and you want to actually display only the records that a user has edit access to. The absolute worst, most inefficient way of doing that is fetching all the billion records and checking them one by one or in a batch, which was our initial approach, right? We said we'll come to that problem later. But now Cerbos is fully capable of giving you a list of predicates to apply to your data fetching layer to be able to only fetch those relevant records based on based on the user's authorization. And that's when we actually built integration samples with Prisma, SQL Alchemy, and Mongoose. Cerbos itself is agnostic to whatever your data fetching layer is. Cerbos itself gives you an abstract syntax tree of all the conditions to apply to your data fetching. And then of course, whoever is implementing it, they need to implement it in their code. So we actually wanted to give examples that are also very much useful for the most common ORMs out there. So that's where we built those three. Yeah. Then coming to the authentication, again, authentication happens upstream from Cerbos. Cerbos is capable of consuming the user information, the directory, the roles and departments and any additional attributes. So all of these examples actually show how you can get that piece of data and how to integrate it into a Cerbos call. And part of that is, the generic JWT token. And Cerbos is also fully capable. And we show here, if you don't want to do your manual integration, you can actually just how to provide the JWT token and how we can actually validate the token and be able to extract values out of it.
Yeah.
And lastly,
just when we get to these deployment models, it's a good opportunity to clarify something, just in case people are maybe not completely clear from the conversation, is that when we talk about the authorization access, we see things like Kubernetes, etc. Yeah. This is all application level resources.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? It's not like we're not giving people access to Kubernetes resources or things like that. No, that's a whole other.
Exactly. This is we are very much so focusing on above the infrastructure, the application you build, and having to handle permissions. And so a very good example of it is like, think about whatever application you're building, the moment you need to enforce the roles and permissions of users in your application, which, I always say, if you leave the world to developers, there'd be only one, that'd be a super user who can do anything, and everybody else couldn't log into a system. But
don't know what you mean. Yeah.
But the reality is, the moment you're building business software where there are multiple users and multiple roles, and they need to collaborate to get a workflow done, and you don't want anybody to step onto each other, you want to have proper governance and responsibilities, roles and permissions come into play in any workflow. And this is to help you enforce those.
Yeah, and I would think, I come from my entry into this world, it was CMSs and CRMs, open source CMSs and CRMs. And of course, everyone at some point built some kind of authentication option. And probably back in those days, it was extremely basic. Yes. But we've all done it.
And that's part of the issue as well, right? So in a lot of those systems, you have generic 3 or 4 permissions, and everybody tries to shoehorn somebody in some role into those 4. And Cerbos enables you to be able to break through that mold, and where it's very easy to be able to compose a new role with a select actions, right? So even when you think about multi-tenant enterprise systems, no two tenants are the same. We've run an enterprise marketing software, right? We have companies where one company had 3 people in it, and it was a mom and pop shop. They had great revenues, etc. But there were essentially 3 people trying to do everything, and they didn't want any of these walls. On the flip side, we had 20, 30,000 people, marketing departments of a global stationery store, where definition of a marketing manager in one of the states in the US is completely different than a marketing manager of Germany. So how do you take each one of the actions and be able to define a region-specific, not only permissions, but also data access and various other controls?
And based on region and et cetera, and even just necessity. Someone in the States doesn't care about greetings cards for Germany per se.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. It's really, really interesting. The hub has been out since November. It was a few months ago. I guess you're still sort of working with that quite a lot and refining it. What's next? What's in the next 6 months to 12 months?
I'll let Alex answer that because I mean he's in
been
charge.
Very patient there. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so we are at the stage now where we have kind of users on board and really kind of testing Cerbos Hub to its extremes, you could say. And what we're really looking at is, okay, we've got developers up and running. They are happy with their systems. They've got Cerbos Hub managing their deployments, etc. But really, when you look at authorization, it's not really developers that are the ones that hold the requirements. It's the product owner, or in some cases, the kind of the security team, or basically the person that has that happens out of a business. So whilst we've made this kind of what we think is like a very nice developer experience, we're also aware that these are the kind of other roles, other personas, other role departments of our business that are also involved in authorization. So we're looking at unlocking more of those and bringing more of those into the Cerbos Hub kind of platform. So one of the things we did early on with the playground, you saw that kind of IDE environment, is it's fully collaborative. So you can we typically see a developer sitting with their product manager or so, either in the office or fully remote, all collaborating on policies together. And right now it is YAML, which at least is understandable, but maybe someone that it doesn't spend all the time in code. But we have kind of plans to like how can we kind of smooth experience and kind of get to a place where policies can be evolved and maybe not necessarily having to write code. So that's kind of the first area we're going to. And then the other kind of, I think the secret superpower you could say of Cerbos is actually in this audit log that the systems produce. So every decision that goes through the Cerbos containers and the Cerbos policy decision point inside of your infrastructure is generating a log. At this time, this principal did this action on this renewals. So it was either allowed or denied by this particular policy.
Yeah, I did see this logs box the whole time. Yeah, we never...
Exactly, yeah. So that logs, every single decision that Cerbos makes generates that log. And right now, how our Cerbos is being used today in both the open source project and with the Cerbos Hub layer on top is those logs are generally picked up by the infrastructure and sent off to the existing log collection system, which is great for like maybe developers to use or SRE teams or DevOps, etc. But again, those are tools really targeted at, you could say like maybe power users, maybe wrong word, but kind of more technically minded. But when it comes to authorization, these logs are actually far more powerful and far more kind of useful and needed by the person that holds that kind of security hat inside of the business. So we'll be doing lots of interviews and testing and such with kind of CISOs, people that sit in like the secure and audit parts of these big businesses, because we have small startups through to billion-dollar enterprises using Cerbos, and the requirements change a lot. And one of the common things we get seeing is like access to audit logs, access to really actually understanding how our system is being used, either proactively to understand what's going on, or maybe reactively when there's been a suspected security incident and you really want to really nail down exactly what happened, who did what. These logs are invaluable to that, and they're very distinct to application logs. So where we're going with Cerbos Hub is actually using Cerbos Hub as that central point to collect all those logs from all the different decision point deployments that are out there and present those in a unified interface, and giving the right tools to these security teams and audit teams to actually access and use these to achieve what they need, which is kind of slightly orthogonal to developer logs, I'd say.
Yeah, it's so your client ticker has been distracting me the whole time because it's sort of scrolling along in the bottom right of my vision. So, you have managed to fill that very unique kind of gap of a technology and a product that everyone knows they have to handle it. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people have to handle it at a certain point. And generally, they just roll their own, and you come along and say, well, let us do it for you. And someone says, actually, that thing we always did on our own was kind of tedious anyway. So, okay, this actually looks quite interesting. So very well done on actually finding a gap that could still be filled, which is an achievement in itself. And yeah, we've already mentioned there is an open source version. So if people want to experiment, they can. Even your managed tier on the free plan is actually
quite
fairly generous.
Yes.
Yeah. If you want to see what Hub offers without committing too much to begin with. And then I would say even your paid tier is not crazy expensive if people do want to experiment properly. So I highly recommend people take a look at cerbos.dev. I think when we last met, you gave me some cool stickers as well of this little... now, what did you say the animal was again?
We call them Cerbi.
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 What is Cerbi?
It comes from Cerbos, the dog that
yeah,
was...
of course, yeah.
That was, guarding the gates. And it's quite a scary dog, right? 3-headed dog. Where we all started with, what if it was a friendly dog? What would it be called? And we came up with Cerbi, and then from there, we're like, oh, Cerbos. And I would love Cerbos because, Cerb operating system or Cerb open source, the OS. There's actually different plays on that. So, yeah.
It's all come together fairly well. So, yeah. Guys, thank you very much for joining me. And I wish you the best of luck in the next few years. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time. And
that was my interview with Cerbos. If you're interested in finding out more, take a look at cerbos.dev. If you want to know more about me, of course, you can leave a comment or subscribe right where you're watching, or you can visit christianscheller.com. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next time.